and gentlemen, the logically faithful. Today I'm going to be interviewing one of my all-time favorite people, Tom Morris. Tom is one of the top public philosophers and pioneers in business thinking and logic. Not necessarily logic per se, but wisdom, literature, and taking that and making it relevant for today. He's done incredible work like how Aristotle would respond to General Motors, and he's got books on this stuff, and Harry Potter, and using the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle and connecting that with the modern world around us today. I am privileged to have Tom with me today. He is a prolific writer. One of his pieces on philosophy of religion and the incarnation is featured in my book, The Christian Apologetics, an Anthology of Primary Sources. So Tom has a wide variety of experience. One of his most prolific and most recent book is Plato's Lemonade Stand, which I highly recommend to you. Tom, welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. Good to be here.
I'm glad you're making it and thriving in this unthrivable time, I guess, in one sense.
That's true. Yeah, you too, man. It's good to see you. You're looking good.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. All right, let me go ahead and begin with something I found fascinating. So the Antonine Plague in 165 AD, or known as the Plague of Galen, was during the Roman Empire. It's when Marcus Aurelius was the emperor, which fascinating to me. He's the only philosopher I know who was an emperor.
Yeah.
I mean, he had people under his beck and call, but he was brilliant.
Yeah.
And he was able to take the people of the Roman Empire through one of the most dangerous plagues that killed over 60 to 70 million people during his time. So in his meditations. Let's start with some general principles, Tom. Since we're in this now, and how can we apply this to our lives now as we are in these times and in isolation? Any general principles to start with as we think through how to be better people, more robust people, more productive people during this time?
Well, you mentioned Marcus Aurelius. He was one of my favorite practical philosophers of all time, along with the prominent lawyer Seneca and the freed slave Epictetus.
Yes.
Interesting, these three guys, right? One a former slave, the lowest level of society, one a prominent lawyer, really kind of upper middle class guy, advisor to the emperor. So he was really kind of the top of his class, and then the emperor himself. So basically the three levels of society in their day. These three guys live in such different lives in a sense, and yet they all speak with one voice about the challenges we face in life. And in fact, I've been going back to them. I was rereading Epictetus the other day, and he said something that reflects the wisdom of, that we all find in Marcus Aurelius too. I mean, there's these common themes amongst the Stoics. Marcus talked about having confidence, even in difficult, challenging times. As a philosopher, I've noticed that too many people look to their circumstances to give them confidence, where it's the other way around. They should be bringing confidence to their circumstances. I believe it was Marcus who had this image of a boxer, and he said, no boxer ever enters the ring with true confidence until he's been beaten black and blue, felt his own teeth rattle under the fist of his opponent, and tasted the floor of the boxing ring. Only then is he able to enter the new match with true confidence, knowing what he can endure, what he can survive, and how he can ultimately perhaps flourish as well. Epictetus has a nice image of this. He says, imagine that you set as your life goal, you want to become an Olympic wrestler.
Okay.
And let's say you have resources. So you hire the best wrestling coach there is. What's this wrestling coach going to do? He's going to throw at you every obstacle, every adversity. He's going to hire the strongest, toughest young guys around to come and wrestle against you. And rather than saying, oh, why am I facing all this terrible stuff? Oh, this is awful. This is happening to me. Why should I have such adversity? Why should I have such opponents? No. He is forming in you a new level of strength, agility, and wisdom about the sport that couldn't otherwise be had. Now, consider this. God is preparing us for a contest much more important than a sporting event, Epictetus says. Won't he, like the best Olympic coaches, throw at us every obstacle, every adversity, opponents that are just amazingly strong? And then what are we going to say? Why am I having to go through all this? No, we should be saying, hey, this is great for all the new strength, agility, and wisdom it's going to cultivate in me. He even has this, Epictetus has this mention of Hercules. He said, imagine Hercules. If he hadn't had to face the lion, the bull, there would be 12 labors of Hercules in the ancient world. Imagine he had just had a calm, peaceful life at home, napping most of the day. He wouldn't have been Hercules, and as soon as I read this, I say to myself, Odysseus was a tertiary character in the Iliad. He was kind of a third level guy in the Iliad. Mm-hmm. But then the war is over. The Trojan War is over, and he gets on his boat to go home. And imagine everybody on the shore saying, hey, bon voyage, Odysseus, smooth sailing, happy voyage, get home soon, say hey to Penelope for us. Suppose things had gone that way. He would never have become the amazing hero he became in the Odyssey. It was because he had to deal with almost unimaginable challenges that he became the great hero, Odysseus. Now, so Epictetus says to us, the things we most complain about. In fact, there's a little book, 80-some pages, written by a lady in her 80s years ago, Florida Scott Maxwell. She was an artist, a psychotherapist, an amazing person. She wrote a book called The Measure of My Days. And in that
Measure of My Days, you said? The Measure of My Days?
The Measure of My Days. Uh-huh. And in that book, she says, the hardest things I've ever been through, the things that I was always griping and complaining about when they were happening, happen to be the things that have created in me the qualities I've most come to admire and be proud of. And she lumps all these qualities under a label of hardihood. Just like Epictetus, just like Marcus Aurelius, and my new book is called Plato's Lemonade Stand because of that old saying, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. What Marcus Aurelius was talking about with the boxer, what Epictetus was talking about with the wrestler and with Hercules, is this alchemy of the spirit, the ability to be transformative. The things that get thrown at us, the toughest and the most difficult, we're not just supposed to lie down and weep. We're not just supposed to lament. In fact, Boethius was this well-connected, politically wonderful guy who was trying to do good for a lot of people. He was very wealthy. He was very powerful, but he did good with his power, accused of false charges, thrown into jail, and he ends up being executed for something he never did right. So he's in the jail cell, and he's complaining, and he's writing down his complaints. He says, the muses, the Greek muses, the beautiful women who inspire came to sit with him so that he could complain more beautifully. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of his laments, this tall, statuesque woman enters the room, the jail cell. How? He doesn't know. It turns out she is philosophy embodied. And she says, what are you doing with these muses helping you complain better? You should stop complaining at all. And she says, we're going to have a talk. And he ends up writing The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the greatest books ever written on how to deal with difficulty. Again, it's the same themes throughout so much of human literature, right? And he said on one occasion it's preparation for death, but what that really means is preparation for life, because you can't die a good death unless you've lived a good life, right?
Let me quote something from one of my all-time favorite authors, Malcolm Muggeridge.
Oh, yeah, good stuff.
Following what you're saying here, I'm just trying to bring it to more articulation.
Yeah.
Contrary to what might be expected, I look back on experiences that I had at the time seemed especially desolating and painful, with particular satisfaction. Indeed, I can say with complete truthfulness that everything I have learned in my 75 years in this world, everything that has truly enhanced and enlightened my existence, has been through affliction and not through happiness, whether pursued or attained. And he harkens back, of course, to the cross, the archetypal symbol of ultimate suffering. Right. So the cross must be borne. Bear your cross in order to have the resurrection. You can't just skip to the resurrection and have the cross. You have to go through that period. You have to, what is it that you mentioned, Tom? The athlete has to break his muscles in order for him to grow. The student has to study long hours for him to pass. The politician has to go through grueling campaigns to win. Why do we want the short circuit path, though? And we expect to have that.
I know. It's as if we all think that this life is supposed to be about ease and comfort. There's nothing wrong with ease and comfort. They can be great respites, great times of rest for us. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Oasis Within that
Yes.
I know you know about.
By the way, I strongly recommend it. I use it in all my philosophy classes.
Oh, is that right? That's great to hear.
Philosophy classes, yeah.
I was quoting from it just today because it's all about creating a place within our spirits of peacefulness and power, a place of calm, a place of competence and confidence and courage.
Walk us through that, Tom. Walk through somebody who can create the oasis within, who's going through the difficulty in the pandemic of a crisis of faith, of a psychological uncertainty. How do you create that oasis within?
Well, you know, in the beginning of my book, it's only about page 3, so it's at the very beginning. A 13-year-old boy, he's just turned 13. He's crossing the desert in Egypt in 1934 with his uncle Ali, who's about 70 years old. And they're at their first break in the travel. The trip has been difficult. They're going through the desert. It's a late summertime. It's very hot. There's sandstorms, all kinds of things. And they get to an oasis. And the boy talks about how much he loves the oasis and wish they could just stay there. And Ali, his uncle, says, well, you know, you can take an oasis with you wherever you go in life. And the boy says, what does that mean? And they have an old camel near him. And Ali says, consider our camel. He never gets too worked up about anything. No matter what happens, he calmly does his job. You know, we can be like him. And Waleed, the boy, says, well, but maybe he doesn't understand how things can harm us and how things can go wrong. And we do. Maybe it's because he thinks very differently from the way we think. And Ali said, well, that's, in a sense, precisely my point. We need to learn to think a little differently from the way we ordinarily do. And then he says something that's meant a huge thing to me. Now, the book came to me as like a movie playing in my head. So I'm just typing. I'm just taking it all down as I hear these characters talk. And Ali says something amazing. He says, have you ever seen a telescope? And Waleed says, yeah, they come from a small village in Western Egypt. He said, yeah, a few years ago, a man visited. He had this telescope, and he gave it to me. I put my eye up to it, like he said, and things that were far away looked really close, and things that were small looked really big. It was amazing. And Ali said, yeah, I had. I'm glad you've had that experience. I had that exact same experience when I was a boy, but then I turned the telescope around and looked through the big end that nobody looked through. And I was just as amazed. Big things became small. Close things that looked far away. And Waleed said, well, I didn't think to do that. And Ali said, well, we each have in our own hearts and minds an emotional telescope. Whenever anything happens that seems challenging or bad or hard, we look through the small end that everybody looks through, and we make everything look bigger and closer and more imposing than it really is. We need to turn our telescope around and shrink things down to size to remind ourselves that we are big enough and powerful enough to deal with whatever we confront. And Waleed says, well, that's amazing. I've never thought that way before. And Ali said, well, but here's the ultimate wisdom. When we've mastered perspective, ultimately we can just lay that telescope down and look at things as they truly are and know in our hearts that we are up to any challenge. And then they go on to talk about the camel living in the present moment, the camel feeling big compared to other things. It's amazing, these little tricks. Within 12 pages, you've learned from this old man how to have an oasis within your own heart, regardless of what's happening around you. And don't we all know people like that? People who seem calm, people who seem, no matter what happens, they're not going to be thrown, right? They're like the great wrestler who always has his balance, who is never going to go down to the mat because generally of what he's been through in the past. Great stuff.
It is amazing, Tom. The book itself has been profound for me and many of my students and my family as well.
Good.
To create that sense of peace and that oasis within, especially during the time when you lay your head down at night, when the troubles of the world seem to come storming in like a hurricane.
Don't they
and you're
know?
going, I can't sleep. There's too much on my mind. And then what I do, and I use this on a personal level, existential level, is I push everything out. I force a gigantic explosion in my head of complete white space. And I create this oasis, a place of serenity, a beautiful, serene area with my little dog running around. And I'm hearing the most beautiful melody. And I'm creating that. I'm beating that over and over again in my head.
Right.
I'm setting my soul up to have this internal piece so that the external physiological reality of my body connects to that. Can you speak, Tom, to the physiological or the biological ability of our bodies to take on what our thoughts do?
Yeah, it's truly incredible, right?
That's really nearly connected.
Yeah, I mean, I first realized this, oddly enough, when I was a professor at Notre Dame. And I could tell during my students loved the stories I would tell. I would tell all kinds of crazy stories from my life and stories about funny people and weird situations to illustrate philosophical points, always.
I love your story.
And I had told a bunch of stories about playing in bands, playing guitar in rock bands. And I knew some of my students were skeptical. This philosopher ever played in bands, you know. So I decided that one day in a lecture on philosophy of science, I was going to use their skepticism and my guitar playing to show something about confirmation and disconfirmation, how theories get raised in probability by positive evidence, which nonetheless don't prove them true. And I was going to surprise them and bring a guitar into class and play it. But I hadn't played in bands in a very long time, and I hadn't really done much private playing for a long time. So for a series of weeks, I would get at night in the basement of my house in South Bend, Indiana. I pull out my guitar, plug it into the amplifier, and figure out what I was going to play in front of them and practice it. And by imagining the students in front of me, 300 or 400 freshmen for Philosophy 101, I actually got nervous in the basement of my house by myself. I was able to double my heart rate and just feel that, you know, feel the feeling I would feel in front of all these people. I thought, wait a minute, if in front of nobody, I can get my body all worked up as if I was in front of a big crowd, why can't I do it the other way around? And that to me is the magic. That to me is the real alchemy, the inner game of everything.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. If you can, no matter what the circumstance, like the first time I was on live national television was Live with Regis and Kathy Lee, which was an ABC morning TV show that was the most popular show on television at the time. And the night before, I just couldn't even sleep. I was so nervous about being on the show for my new book, True Success. And so I said to myself, it suddenly occurred to me, this what I call the inner game of everything. I said to myself, you know, Regis shows up and sits on that sofa just like I walk downstairs and have breakfast in the morning, just like and at that point, walk in front of my students at Notre Dame. You know, it was just a Monday morning. I'm in front of my students at Notre Dame. Well, that's the way it was for Regis at ABC Studios. So I said, I'm going to borrow some of Regis's comfort, and I'm going to use it during that time I'm on his show. I'm going to be as comfortable on that show as he is. I'm going to pretend like it's my normal everyday job. It totally transformed the way I thought about the situation. And I thought to myself, you know, I was going to be in front of 5,000 people one day. And I entered the Coliseum the night before, and I saw the 5,000 empty seats, and I got scared to death of that, speaking to that many people the next morning. I saw in the dark Coliseum, there was one lighted sign. It said exit. That's exactly what I wanted to do. Go leave the place, go back to the airport and fly home. But then I thought, I've got to switch my thinking. And I said to myself just spontaneously, tomorrow, this is my house for an hour. Tomorrow, I own this place. It's where the Milwaukee Bucks used to play basketball, the Mecca in Milwaukee. Tomorrow, I own this place for an hour. It's my house. I get to do something good for every person in every one of these seats. It's going to be so much fun. I can't believe it. I changed my thinking, and when I walked in front of those 5,000 people, I was not nervous at all. Now, my heart rate was up, and I used to always say, uh-oh, I'm getting nervous. I learned to say, I'm getting ready. Because the best people in every field who care about what they're doing, they feel this increased presence in their body, this increased energy, and they often say, oh, I'm getting nervous. But I say, I'm getting ready. There are all these ways that we can play these games on ourselves, because just like the Malcolm Muggeridge quote, the worst things that have ever happened to me have opened the doors to the best things that have ever happened to me. And it wasn't obvious at the time. It's like the old saying, have you ever heard anybody say getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me? I've heard a lot of people say that looking back on their lives, but at the time it happened, And the guy says, I'm sorry, Bob, we're going to have to downsize here. And, it's not your fault, but you don't have a job now. Can you imagine Bob saying, well, that's the greatest thing I've ever heard. That's wonderful. Can I call my wife and tell her? No, Bob, you can't use the telephone anymore. Well, that's even better. No, that's not the way he thought of it at the time. But later,
it's not natural to do that, right?
No, that's right. And even Steve Jobs, when he was forced out of Apple, he went to bed for 6 weeks. He could hardly get out of bed. He ends up saying years later that was the best thing that had ever happened to him.
So you have to go through the valley of the shadow, suffering, not only in a reality sense, concrete sense, but also psychologically or existentially. Yep. You have to actually crash within in order to get built up.
You do. You really do, Calvin. And so if we can remember the wisdom of Malcolm Muggeridge, if we can remember what Steve Jobs learned, if we can remember what Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were talking about, and this is all through the Bible as well, things that, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good. All these things that, Romans 8:28, all things work together for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. All things. What can separate us from the love of God? Absolutely nothing. No matter how, the Apostle Paul, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. Why? Because he's learned that no matter how bad those circumstances seem, they're going to play a positive role.
Here's my struggle, Tom, as a philosopher. My ideas are theoretical, hypothetical. Let's bring them some flesh and blood, which you do very well with your stories and examples here with Steve Jobs. Let me bring in some great thinkers here. So I have Augustine and Jerome. Let's contrast the two. So Augustine and Jerome lived around the same time, which is when the fall of the Roman Empire. So Jerome was a brilliant scholar, spent most of his life living outside of the cave near Bethlehem. Around 420, the Visigoths had sacked Rome, and Jerome despaired. He said the world, quote, has sunk into ruin. He retreated into his cave, and a while later he died. Augustine, in contrast, also despaired at the fall of Rome. By 24 AD, according to the record we have, after the Visigoths attacked, Augustine retreated and wrote one of the greatest masterpieces of history, The City of God.
Yep.
I would like us to take this apart, Tom.
Yeah.
For some people, as Friedrich Nietzsche says, what doesn't kill you will strengthen you and grow you.
Right.
But for others, it makes them bitter, angry, resentful, and want to go to hell and take everyone with them.
Yeah, right. You're absolutely right. And the
Stoics, that separates the Jeromes of the world from the Augustines, from the Nietzsches, to the Steve Jobs. Help us to parse that out in our own minds.
Well, the Stoics were always emphasizing, Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, and who lived through the Holocaust, who lived through the concentration camps in Germany, and he said they could take everything away from me except one thing: the freedom to choose my own attitudes. And it's like, Jerome made a choice he was not forced to make in his attitude. Augustine made a choice he was not forced to make. They were both free with respect to this ultimate thing that Viktor Frankl says cannot be taken away, no matter how hard. Now, there are things that are big, and my two characters in The Oasis Within, there's a nice little discussion about that kind of draws on a Stoic image, where Ali says, if the fire in your heart is a very tiny flame, and people just dump a bunch of trash on it, it can put it out. But if the fire in your heart is a huge flame, then the same amount of trash dumped on it just becomes more fuel for the fire. Yeah. And that's Augustine, right? That's Augustine. That was his approach. And why I think in part he was so wise was that his mother was so wise. He grew up with the influence of wisdom in his life. His mother said some amazing things. There's a dialogue on happiness where they're having a picnic one day, and Augustine just makes some off-the-hand remarks, and his mother has to kind of correct him a little bit and say, let's think about this a little bit more. So he grew up with this kind of influence, a very wise elder guide to help him get his bearings in the world. And that among all the things that she would have imparted to him must have been something about difficulties and challenges, because look at the way he responded. So while we do have a choice, we all have a choice, whether to be positive or whether to be crushed in difficult circumstances. Often the way we use that choice will be influenced by the people we've been around and the voices we've listened to across the years we've lived. So I tell people, Yeah.
Go ahead, finish your.
I just say to people, network with sages, hang out with wise people, because that's
Yeah.
the way you become wiser yourself.
And one of the ways I could do that is by picking up books by Augustine, Jerome, and others, and just reading about them. It's like connecting to a part of their soul. I'm seeing
It
into
is.
their psyche.
That's right. It very much is. And so, and
So,
you know, we read a lot of great literature that reinforces the view. Oliver Goldsmith, in the 18th century, British author, wrote a book called The Vicar of Wakefield. And The Vicar of Wakefield is a book about a guy who has just terrible thing after terrible thing after terrible thing happen to him. And it would be crushing to anybody's spirit. But by the end of the story, he comes to realize how all these things have contributed to what would be his good, not his ill or harm. And so, I mean, Jane Austen, all her novels are about people bringing their own assumptions and prejudices to situations and not seeing things as they are, but seeing things under false appearances. Again and again and again, some of the best literature teaches us Plato's distinction between appearance and reality. People are crushed by appearances, whereas the realities are very different.
I can say amen to that. Let me ground this back here. So at Logically Faithful, one of my main motifs is to engage culture redemptively and address suffering productively, using apologetics and theological analysis of the scientific rigor and logical coherence. Now, with that said, I've noticed not only in my own life on a subliminal level, but many of my brothers and sisters, we try to use our theology to manipulate our ontology of our life, or manipulate God, if I may put it another way. I will be a good person. I'll do the right things. I'll be faithful, logical, consistent. And then good things is going to happen to me. But then the waves crash. I lose the job. The wife walks out. The child dies. Yeah. And I'm thinking, what did I do wrong?
Right.
I wonder, I mean, you don't have to be an atheist or materialist or narcissist to have a false view of reality. Right. You can also have that even if you're grounded theologically.
That's right. I mean, in Deuteronomy, for example, in what we Christians refer to as the Old Testament, there does seem to be a promise made about what those in the East call karma. You know, do good things and God will take care of you. Do bad things, good luck. You know, that our actions directly have an impact on our lives. And there's a commonsensical way in which most of the time, most of us see those kinds of laws playing out, right? The guy who cheats everybody, nobody trusts him, and he doesn't have any friends anymore. And so we do see those things working out. But yet it's the occasional dramatic counterexample.
Right? Yeah, right. The world.
That you know, we wouldn't have the entirety of the Psalms, for example, if David's life had gone pretty well, right? I mean, he's always saying, "Oh Lord, why is this happening to me?" Right? We got the book of Job, right? But then you have Jesus. When the disciples say, "Hey, this tower fell down on these people," you know, were they responsible because of their sin? Jesus said, "No, you're not supposed to even think about it like that." So Jesus knew something about the divine economy of this world. That I think Socrates understood, Plato understood, and some of the Stoics understood, that things can happen to harm our bodies. Things can happen to harm the bodies of those we love. Things can happen to reshuffle the relationships of bodies in the world. But with respect to my own soul, I'm the only one capable of harming that. No matter how evil a person is, no matter how they try to destroy my reputation, to take all my worldly goods away from me, nobody can touch my soul. And so if my soul reacts properly to all these things, I become a better, deeper, and stronger person. That person has degraded their soul in what they've tried to do to me. So the ultimate harm, the real harm that matters, the spiritual harm, is all on them. They are making themselves worse people with every act they perform, not me. You know, if I'm not the one, if I'm not the perpetrator, if I'm not the guilty party, if I'm the sufferer, so to speak, you know who's really suffering the evil? The wrongdoer, not me, the intended victim.
You know, Tom, I've been reflecting upon this, and I want to, if I can push back on this and ask your wisdom on it. The Platonic position that no evil can befall a good man,
right,
when Jesus was on the cross, he said to his Father, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." For they're the ones who are doing the evil and suffering at a greater, deeper existential level. However, it would be naive of us to say, wait a minute, isn't that blood coming out of your wounds, Jesus?
Right, right.
There is a sense of pain that you can inflict upon another, and no matter how much I say it's not affecting me, I mean, rape and genocide, and they can happen on an individual level where somebody tortures another, even whether it's in the kindergarten playground or in the business or in the White House or the outhouse.
Right.
Other people can. I can't say that, oh, it's only me. I can only control my inner world. There's something about the outside world that can affect my inner world, even subliminally.
Well, look at it like this. Let's imagine for a moment, just for the sake of argument here, imagine that Plato was right, that nobody can harm a good man. The better you are, the less you can be harmed. Well, Jesus was the perfect man, so he's impossible to harm. So then the Plato is going to say, well, they harmed his body on the cross, but not him. All right, let's grant him that for a minute, just tentatively. So let's rewind back the film a little bit to Gethsemane. Now, in Gethsemane, it's clearly not the body that's being harmed. It's clearly the man himself who is suffering. Take this from me, take this cup from me. Jesus is going through, if he's going to redeem us from the mental suffering as well as physical suffering, he's got to experience it. And if he's going to have an alchemistic transformational impact on the ways in which we suffer the most deeply, it can't just be about his body being cut and bleeding. It's got to be about something deeper than that, right? But Jesus' case also, so let's suppose then that we've refuted Plato in one instance at least, that the best man could suffer perhaps the worst, which is contrary to his theory, right? So, but in that one case, that suffering was so transformative as to change the world. So the ultimate positive transformation comes out of the ultimate negative suffering. So was he harmed after all? We're not asking whether he suffered. We're asking whether he was harmed by that suffering after all.
Ultimately, no, it made him, I guess it made the situation better long term.
Powerful. It gave the suffering conferred the greatest power. Henry Nouwen, the great spiritual writer, in his book, The Wounded Healer, makes that analogy for all of us, I think, that it's only insofar as we are wounded that we can be healers ourselves. So like Florida Scott Maxwell, the things that are the hardest for us to endure while they're happening end up, used right, being transformative for the good. Now, it doesn't follow from that if I see a person suffering, I should not go help him, because if I leave him to suffer, that it can be transformative for him and he can become stronger and better and wiser. No, because then I make myself implicit in making myself a worse person in order to try to make him a better person, so to speak, right? That's taking philosophy the wrong way. You have to understand all the applications, in a sense, in a deep, difficult issue like this, in order to get any of the applications right. And so the pushback is absolutely proper, because we can't be glib about inner suffering. It happens. But as the telescope analogy illustrates, as the reference to the wrestlers and the boxers, and all, ultimately then it's up to us what we're going to do with it. So it does not cease to exist, but it's transformed into something positive.
I'm applying the Jesus issue. Of course, it would be naive to say he didn't suffer. He did suffer. It's obvious. And he had to suffer for us vicariously for us. And an athlete has to suffer in order for him to grow and build his muscles. So there's something there that's the Platonic idea of the divorce between the body and the soul, the Descartesian, Cartesian dualistic position, which I find very attractive, although problematic at the deepest level, because we are a psychosomatic unity. We're not just two separate beings kind of glued together.
That's right.
We're together. But at the same time, we want to create this environment for ourselves and our children where the difficulty is there because they need to grow, but at the same time shield them from the outside pains of the world. But to do that is to create a narcissistic, pleasure-oriented individual who doesn't experience the outside world. We can't protect them too much, can we?
I know. Well, that's the irony of it, right? That the protective instincts can end up creating a cocoon of comfort and pleasure around people that keep them from growing into spiritually mature individuals.
Let me bring this home, and you can comment on it. So I read a book a number of years ago that was transformative for me and financially. It was called The Millionaire Next Door.
Oh, I've
The
heard of that.
Secrets of America's Wealthy, done by major economists Thomas Stanley and William Dunko. One of their analyses is that the worst thing you can do for your children, if you do have a significant amount of wealth, is to give it to them.
Right.
You will dumb them down and take away the glory and the wonder and the awe and the strength and the virtues that made you who you are, struggling to get it. If you just dump it on them and dump them a life of luxury, do not expect resilient, strong characters in your children. But then there's a paradox. I will go to war, my son, so you don't have to.
Right.
Hold on a minute. The very fact that I went to war made me the character that you want your son to be. How do you work this around with your own family, Tom, or your students?
I think it. Right. It's almost as if we want our children to experience less difficulties than we did. That's honorable. That's altruistic. That's loving. And yet Aristotle had this idea that for every virtue, there are two vices. Every virtue is a middle way between two extremes, the extreme of too much and the extreme of too little. There are parents that throw too much difficulty on their children for precisely the reason that world history teaches us that if kids are too pampered, if they're given too much too soon, that has a deleterious effect. So some parents go to the opposite extreme, and they are Marine sergeants, the drill sergeants to their kids. The kids end up being just as messed up, but in different ways in that kind of environment, right? So Aristotle would have us consider the two extremes, right? The overly protective helicopter parent who doesn't want their kid to suffer at all in any way, right? And then the Marine drill sergeant parent that's just going to rub their noses in suffering to make them stronger people. No. Those are both extremes. The virtue is in the middle. The virtue is to guard your children against unnecessary difficulties, unnecessarily severe difficulties, but knowing that you have to let them live their lives and take their bumps and bruises. And sometimes that's difficult for us as parents to suffer through along with them. Why wasn't I more careful? Why did I let her go to that event? Why did I let him be in that situation? We guilt ourselves with making a mistake, but everybody's going to make mistakes. Mistakes are as common in life as breaths. I mean, I live my life at this point of 68 years old on a high mountain of mistakes, right? From which I can see far. And sometimes I feel like I've piled up my mountain of mistakes so high, the air is hard to breathe up here. But that's the way we develop the possibility of deeper wisdom in life. So we never get it exactly right.
What's that balance that you talk about with Aristotle?
What's that?
The balance.
The balance. And again, in The Oasis Within, one of the characters talks about a balance beam, a guy walking on the high wire, how he's always a little out of balance to one side or the other. But balance is never perfect. It's a dynamic process of correcting and recorrecting. So rather than beating yourself up with guilt, I let my kids be too unsupervised, or I'm being too protective as a father, without beating yourself, just adjust, adapt from what you yourself are learning. Don't plan on not making a mistake. Plan on learning from your mistakes and adjusting your behavior accordingly. That's the key.
That's the key. Interesting. Tom, a number of years, 2 years ago, I had a paradigm shift in how I do work, productivity-wise.
Wow.
I would sometimes work myself to the bone, psychologically speaking, 12, 16-hour days working on my books, my writing. And then it dawned on me I need to do something that God talked about in the Ten Commandments. It's called take a break. Just take a Sabbath. Yeah. And I realized, even just started reading work from the Harvard Business Review on psychological adaptability of the greatest movers and shakers in the productivity arena, that those who do the most are those who take enough significant breaks.
Yeah.
And when you do take a break, you end up doing better what you're doing than if you don't. So I found that to be extremely helpful. So now I plan my days where I have time I can play, time I can relax, and time I can work my butt off, then stop and repeat the process.
That's
and
right.
I've done much more work than ever before.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That chapter in the Oasis Within, it's chapter 2 or 3, where they talk about balance. That discussion has meant a lot in my life because, again, what you've learned is there are different phases within your day, and it's not just that. And it's good if you can take a day off a week for completely from work. That's wonderful. But if you can insert these breaks into your day, whether it's a friend of mine who is one of the most active, strongest people I've ever known, but he loves to take naps, to take short naps every afternoon.
Yeah.
And for a long time, I resisted that because it wasn't productive time, you know. But like you, I've learned that no, it's a way of refueling the engine. It's a way of making the coming time more productive. So it averages out to be a little higher rather than a little lower. Again, appearance and reality. The guy who takes breaks, the guy who makes time for play, for naps, looks like a less productive person. That's the appearance. But the reality is he can be a lot more productive.
And you know what? I feel a lot more joyous, more peaceful.
Yeah.
Because
I bet that's right.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up and start landing this wonderful airplane here on the concept of the most important issues of all philosophy, which is the very word in the root word of philosophy itself, wisdom.
Yeah.
So let's define wisdom and move forward with that. So one of my all-time heroes in the apologetics arena, Ravi Zacharias, who right now is suffering heavily. He's toward his deathbed, from what I've been reading about. Anyway, I followed him throughout the years. He's been a great encouragement to me. I met him once with my little boy, Daniel Zacharias, which I named after him, Zacharias. And we came up to him, and Daniel told him, hey, tomorrow's my birthday. He said, oh, go, great. What do you want for your birthday? He was, I think, 6 at the time.
Yeah.
And he said to Ravi Zacharias, I want wisdom. Of course, he was all impressed. Everyone was impressed. Oh, wow, wisdom, that's wonderful. And then Ravi asked him the paradigm question. So what is wisdom? And little Zacharias responded, I have no idea. We were all cracking up. But, Tom, after teaching philosophy now for over a decade, sometimes I have to say I have no idea. Because,
You'll know it when you see it.
There is a wisdom. I know the basic definition. But to get wisdom?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead. Tell us about that. What is wisdom, and how do you
I used to,
in your own life?
My quickest definition of wisdom, and not all philosophy, I'm the first to admit that not all philosophy in the modern world is about wisdom. At its best, it's about understanding, but not all understanding is wisdom. I can understand a theory in chemistry or in physics, and it doesn't necessarily give me wisdom.
Right.
Wisdom, I used to think that the quickest definition was that wisdom is insight for living. And then sometimes I would say wisdom is insight for healthy living. Wisdom is insight for deep and happy, fulfilling living. And then I went even further and realized it's not just insight, it's embodied insight. It makes no sense to say of a person, he's a very wise man, but he lives like a fool. On the deepest level of wisdom, that makes no sense, because wisdom is essentially embodied. If you don't live it, you don't have it. The most you have is the parrot's version of being able to utter aphorisms and profound sounding sentences, but you don't have it. You don't embody it. You don't live it. Wisdom is a dispositional capacity. It's a disposition not only to think the right thoughts, but to feel the right feelings and have the right attitudes and perform the right actions. When this is not fully functioning in your life, you're not fully wise. Now, like everything in the world, I don't think that this is a light switch. It's on or off. You're wise or you're a fool. There's a spectrum. It's more like the dimmer switch for a light. There's a long spectrum, and you can be more or less wise along that spectrum, or along different dimensions of your life. You could be very wise with respect to your work, but foolish in relationships, or vice versa.
Right.
So that wisdom, I had a philosophy student visit me from Spain, from Madrid, about a year ago. And we sat and had breakfast together, and that was his opening question, what is wisdom? And I said something to him that I'd never said before. In fact, I don't even know I'd ever thought it. I said, wisdom is guidance and guardrails. And he said to me, he spoke English, but not like an American. He said, "What is guardrails?" I said, you're driving through the mountains, you're on a narrow road, there's a twisty turn, there's a metal there's a metal railing or a fence or an obstacle so your car won't go off the side. He said, yeah, I know what you mean, guardrails. I said, wisdom is guidance and guardrails. He said, what does that mean? I said, guidance helps you find what's worth seeking, what's worth doing. And guardrails keeps you from going off the side as you venture in that right direction. Wisdom is about those two things. And then another day I was thinking wisdom is about rules and reminders. There are some rules of thumb that wisdom gives us, the spoken wisdom, the realized wisdom, rules and reminders, and they help us embody. They help us to have these dispositions. They aren't themselves the fullness of wisdom, which is always in a person, in a being, in a spirit, but we can capture various facets of wisdom in wise sayings, in illustrations like the telescope. But wisdom is always about living, guidance and guardrails to spur us on to doing the right things and keeping us from falling into the wrong things. That wisdom, the wiser a person is, the less that person will make mistakes that really matter. We all make little mistakes, but the wiser a person is, it's almost, but you talk to a wise person and they'll sometimes be very self-critical, because Dag Hammarskjöld, who used to be head of the United Nations, once said, on a perfectly white tablecloth, any speck of dust is visible. So in a life of a person who's cleansed themselves of so much taint and so much dirt and so much, even the smallest speck. So the Apostle Paul starts off characterizing himself as the least of the apostles, and years later he's calling himself the greatest of sinners. Well, that looks like he made reverse progress. No, he just became more sensitive to the small problems. So the wise person, the ultimate, the Stoics used to say their word for this was the sage, the perfectly wise person, doesn't exist. And well, like any ideals aren't necessarily to be realized in the world. They're to be aspired toward. They goad us in the right direction. Nick Rescher once wrote a book about ideals where he said, so what's the point of having ideals if you can't realize them? Like perfect justice and perfect this and perfect that. Right. Well, it's to motivate us to go in the right direction, right? Only God embodies these things perfectly, but we're to shoot in that direction, and we improve and grow as we try. Well, that's what wisdom is like. It's a philosophia, love of wisdom. When an object of love, when you lack it, you pursue it. When you have it, you embrace it. Philosophy is the pursuit and embracing of wisdom, insight for living. All the other stuff, like how do words refer to objects and how to understand modal operators and modal logic, all that stuff is icing on the cake. But the real wisdom comes in deeper embodied insight for living well, or as we Christians would say, in a godly way, in the way that we were created to live, which involves wonderful things like courage and kindness and compassion and transformation, adaptability, and the things that we've been talking about. All these things go to make for wisdom. That's kind of my short answer.
Wow, that's profound, Tom. In the scriptures, I think I mentioned twice, it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When you see people disregarding the moral law, they have no fear of God, so to speak, no fear of consequences.
Right.
And that shows a lack of wisdom.
Right.
Can you speak to what that means, being understanding that what is on the other side of those rails that you mentioned?
Yeah.
If I cross that line, sometimes there are lines that you cross that you can never come back from.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about those, Tom, a little bit. And how is wisdom, the fear of the Lord, being the beginning of wisdom theologically? And philosopher Peter Kreeft from Boston College says, although the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, it's not the end.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, breaking through the guardrails and going over the side is always about self-diminishment, and ultimately it can be about as much as self-destruction. And that's why the guardrails are there, to help prevent us from self-diminishment, self-corruption, self-destruction. And the fear of the Lord, as I understand it, through both testaments, is about the awe and the deepest reverence toward God and God's world. It's about having the deepest respect and the greatest degree of seriousness about the structure of God's nature and the nature of God's world. I believe that God has structured the world to reflect God's nature. And so the moral aspect and spiritual aspect of God's nature is reflected by spiritual laws in our world. So that if we don't have the right guidance and we chase the wrong things, we get the wrong results. If we do have the right guidance and chase the right things, but go over the side on a twisty turn on the mountain, and many people in seeking to do good for others go over the edge. The doctor who neglects his family, the pastor who gets involved in all kinds of things that he didn't dream of doing in divinity school, but it was the adulation of the congregation and the growing of the church that gave him a certain kind of hubris, a certain kind of pridefulness, that then he went over the edge. He was not using the guardrails that are in place for us to keep him from going over the edge. Time and again, this happens. Can we survive it, or do we not survive it? I think God gives us a lot more chances than we deserve, really. But that's grace, that's mercy, right? And so we've got to respect these guardrails, and we've got to have what Kierkegaard called fear and trembling, or what Rudolf Otto in the book The Idea of the Holy, this mysterium tremendus, this sense of mystery and wonder, and I stand on holy ground, and who am I? What is man that thou art mindful of him in the Psalms? All this is bundled together in what we have the phrase, fear of the Lord. It's to be the utmost respect. And even the Stoic philosophers talked about having in your head someone that you have the utmost respect for. Carry that person with you, your moral paradigm. Carry him with you in everything you do. Would I want him seeing me do this? Would I want to have to tell him that I have done this, that I have made this choice? The Stoics believed, like most wise people through history, that we become like the people we're around, and not just the people we're around physically, but the people we're around emotionally, the people we think on, the people we carry in our heads. And so, ultimately, carry God in your head. That's why Jesus said, he who's seen me has seen the Father. Carry him in your head to know how to guide what the guidance and guardrails would be in this particular situation. And none of us do that perfectly, and we suffer the consequences. And then we've learned deeply the importance of it all.
Wow, Tom, that's profound. Thank you. This has been very helpful, and I'm hoping the wisdom that you shared will trickle down and have some deep roots, and will grow into some wonderful plants that will overcome and overshadow people in their life. I know wisdom was it Jesus said, if you have faith like a mustard seed, it'll be enough to grow so high that the birds themselves will settle in it. Well, everything starts with that little seed, and I hope the seeds that you planted will do that. And I'm actually pretty confident of it.
Good.
So, Tom, thank you for your time.
Khaldun, a great pleasure. I'd invite any listener to come to tomvmorris.com, V as in Victor, tomvmorris.com for more wisdom anytime, or to shoot me an email, ask me a question. I'd be glad to philosophize.
Sure. All right. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks again.